Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for joining us today. We're going to give folks just a few more minutes to log on, and then we'll get started. All right, everyone, we're going to get started now. Welcome to today's webinar, Taking Stock and Looking Ahead, the Impact of COVID-19 on Communities of Color. My name is Tupa Haveka. I'm the Program Associate on the Field Engagement team at Prosperity Now. And before we get started, I'd like to just cover a few housekeeping announcements. First, this webinar is being recorded and will be mailed to all registrants and available online within 1 week. Currently, all webinar attendees are muted to ensure sound quality, but we really want this to be interactive. So please ask a question or share your thoughts at any time by typing into the questions box of your GoToWebinar control panel. And if you experience any technical issues, please email us at gotomeeting@prosperitynow.org. So to get the most out of today's call, join us from a quiet space, grab a coffee, a snack, and settle in. And again, we really do want this to be engaging, so please send your questions and comments as you listen along. And we also encourage you to reflect on ways to apply what you learned today to your own work. With that said, on today's webinar, you'll be hearing from Prosperity Now, which is a national nonprofit organization based in Washington, D.C. And our mission is to ensure everyone in our country has a clear path to financial stability, wealth, and prosperity. First, today's webinar is sponsored by the Asset Building Policy Network, which is a coalition of the civil rights and asset building organizations, together with a financial institution that through policy advocacy, research, and program solutions is committed to expanding economic opportunities for low-income members of communities of color. The ABPN is comprised of 7 members, 4 of which you'll be hearing from on today's webinar. And with that being said, I'm going to turn it over to Emmanuel Nieves. He is the Associate Director of Policy at Prosperity Now. Emmanuel, take it away. Oh, you're on mute, Emmanuel.
That helps. All right, let's try that again. Thank you, Tupa, and thank you everyone for joining us for today. Taking some time out of your day to join a good group of panelists and researchers and advocates really for communities of color and the betterment of their economic well-being. I wanted to briefly just kind of, Tupa, if you would tab over, if that's okay, just mention very quickly the agenda for today's discussion. And hopefully by the end of this, the panel will have discussed and you'll get a better sense or maybe a more current sense of kind of the economic impact of this crisis on communities of color and small businesses, how philanthropy and the private sector is working to support communities of color at this moment, and really impacted communities at this moment, particularly small businesses and small business owners impacted by this crisis. And then, talking a little bit about the kind of picking an assessment and looking ahead at the policy response to this crisis, what's worked and what needs to be done in the months ahead to support families as we kind of get through this winter and hopefully on the other end of this in the next year. And following the panel discussion that Tupa had mentioned, we'll open it up to audience Q&A. Again, if you're able to, please, as folks are presenting, feel free to send in your questions. We will get to them at the end, but it's helpful to have them, in advance as we get to the end of the discussion. And so with that, I'd like to just briefly introduce our panelists. So on today's webinar, we have Ana Esparza. She's a Senior Manager of Strategic Initiatives at the National Association for Latino Asset Builders, or NALCAB. We also have Guillermo Cantor, who is the Director of Applied Research here at Prosperity Now, and a colleague of mine in Chupas. We also have Joyce Pisnanet, Director of Economic Empowerment at the National Coalition for Asian Pacific American Community Development, or National Capacity. We also have Abby Langston, who's a Senior Associate at PolicyLink. In addition to them, we also have Tina Correa, who's Vice President of National Initiatives at City Community Investing, and Development. And then finally, we have Rob Randava, who's a Senior Counsel at the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights. And with that, Tuba, if you would mind tabbing over just one more time for the moment. I'd like to invite the panelists to turn on their cameras so we can start this conversation. Quite a few cameras. Awesome. So I think before, just to ground a little bit of a conversation and some of the kind of the impacts that I know Ana and Joyce will talk about, and obviously, kind of the policy response, or taking stock of the policy response. I wanted to start the conversation with research and data, and really, this is a conversation with Guillermo and Abby. As two researchers who have been spending a lot of time this year, like many other folks, looking at the impacts of this crisis and its spillover effects on communities of color, on businesses, on other parts of the economy. I wanted to ask you if you could just give us a sense of what that research has uncovered in these last few months. And then also, could you also give us a sense of why so many communities of color were so vulnerable to the effects of this crisis in the first place, from an economic perspective?
Sure, I'm happy to go first. Hi, everyone. Thanks, Emmanuel, for the introduction, and thank you, Tupa. So I can start by sharing with all of you how Prosperity Now approached this issue of understanding what the impact of the crisis was, especially on vulnerable communities. So as you may recall, now it feels like it happened a century ago, but back in March, April, we started to hear some of the first rates of infections and death that basically highlighted the fact that communities of color were being disproportionately impacted by this public health crisis. And so at the time, we also wanted to know whether these impacts were also happening in other domains, specifically if these groups were also more likely to be affected financially. The problem we ran into then is that we didn't have fresh data to examine the effects in real time. So we had two options there. One was, and by that I mean the major sources of data that we usually rely on, like data sets from the US Census Bureau, take a while. There is a lag between the moment the data is collected and the moment it's made available. So all the data was kind of speaking to a world that was no longer current. So what we decided to do at the time was two things. One is try to leverage the data that we already had. We had our Prosperity Now scorecard, a lot of you may be familiar with, to help understand which groups were already vulnerable even prior to the crisis. And by that, I mean that they would be more likely to be immediately hit financially by the effects of the crisis. And then B is try to conduct some sort of ad hoc survey to better examine how these households, especially low and moderate income households, were able to navigate this crisis in real time, how they were going through this, how they were able to meet their financial needs, or if they were not able to. So in the first month after the crisis hit, what we did was we created a profile. There is a paper that I think Emmanuel has shared the link with all of you, and probably it's going to be shared in the chat box. And in this report, what we did was create a profile of all the groups that we knew were already particularly vulnerable financially. One big group that we determined was likely to be immediately hit was the millions of households, about 45 million households that did not have enough cash on hand to weather an emergency. And so we call this liquid asset poverty. That's how we refer to this condition, and that means that a household doesn't have enough cash on hand or emergency savings to subsist at the poverty level for 3 months without income. And so at the time, we knew that a lot of people were losing their jobs. We knew how many unemployment claims were being filed. It was like a major catastrophe. And so this is a group that basically we wanted to draw attention to, especially as the government was planning its response to, assist those in financial need. The second big group, and there is an overlap, of course, across these groups, but basically those who did not have the capacity to keep their jobs or were working in occupations that economists call the secondary labor market. These are the jobs that pay very little or don't come with benefits, employer-sponsored benefits, for example, or that have little stability. And so according to the most recent data, what we knew is that roughly 28 million households, 28 million individuals nationwide were employed in these low-wage occupations, and these comprise roughly 17% of the civilian labor force. When you look at the demographic distribution of the population in the labor market, what we see is that racial and ethnic minorities, immigrants, and women are more likely to work in those occupations that we consider to be vulnerable for the reasons I just described. The fourth group that was deemed particularly vulnerable was undocumented immigrants, who face additional challenges. In addition to being likely to work in those jobs that we just described, they're also largely excluded from accessing social supports, public safety nets. And so we have in the country roughly, almost 11 million undocumented immigrants. The estimates fluctuate there because this is not actually based on a census, but on estimates that take a lot of factors into account. And this includes roughly 7.6 million workers. So it's about roughly 5% of the labor force is comprised by these workers. The fifth element we highlighted there was workers in occupations and states that failed to provide those workers with very basic vital protections and benefits. And specifically here, we're talking about people who work in domestic service, for example, that are excluded from protections in most states. Workers in services, food service, agricultural sector that face additional, challenges when it comes to having safety nets in place to protect them from a crisis, any crisis, let alone a crisis of this magnitude. So I'll stop there because I know that we don't have a lot of time, but I'm happy to follow up with you on any of these items I just mentioned. And I think I'm going to talk later about something else we learned through a survey that we filled later in the year. So I'll turn it back to you, Emmanuel.
Actually, to Abby, if you can add a little bit more. Abby,
yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, it's a perfect place for me to jump in and really appreciate the context Guillermo gave. So I lead the development of the National Equity Atlas, which is a formal research partnership between PolicyLink, which is my organization, and the Equity Research Institute at USC. So I just want to make sure to acknowledge them and that partnership in terms of the research that we've been doing has been through that partnership and working really closely together. So we've done a handful of reports looking at the economic impacts of COVID, primarily through a workforce equity lens, looking at the labor market impacts, what's happening to jobs and industries, occupational families, and of course, the workers who are navigating these challenges. So found much the same conclusions that Guillermo was describing in terms of particularly Black, Latinx, and Native American workers being really overrepresented in the jobs that were hit the first and hardest by the downturn. So those so-called non-essential jobs. And now 8 months later, we're seeing that these same communities are really at heightened risk of long-term unemployment and all of the cascading challenges that accrue to that. We also found that people of color are overrepresented in the more stable, essential occupations that maybe haven't been disrupted as much economically, but put them at higher risk of exposure to the virus. So there are those jobs like mine that can be done remotely from home. Then there are, the essential service jobs that really require close proximity to other people and interaction with the community, the kinds of work that have really kept our economy afloat. And those jobs tend to be low wage, low quality, facing this kind of double jeopardy, both in terms of the economic consequences of those job quality issues and the health and safety consequences for essential workers who are not fairly compensated and are not adequately protected, either in terms of their labor rights as workers or in terms of their health and the kind of equipment and policies that we would need in place for them to do their jobs safely. So, much the same kinds of workers and jobs that Guillermo was talking about. So I won't say too much more about that. But we approach this from the lens of understanding that prior to COVID, the economic realities facing working people in this nation were already in a state of crisis. The crisis did not start in February. It didn't start in April. Already 1 in 3 people, that's more than 100 million people in this nation, were economically insecure, so living in or near poverty. And just in the last 6 months, we know that about 9 million more have fallen into poverty. So there was a crisis before that is deepening. Prior to the crisis, 6 in 10 Black and Latinx households were already rent burdened, already with the kind of tight labor market and the low unemployment rates that we were seeing. 60% of those families were already paying too much for housing. And now we're on the front end of what could become a really catastrophic wave of displacement and evictions that this crisis is deepening. And in terms of the workforce dynamics, where a lot of our research has focused, we know that there were pre-existing inequities and really deep structural racism in the labor market that kind of set the stage for what we're seeing today. Some of those factors that I think have really contributed to the way that the differential impacts of the crisis have played out, you have to talk about occupational segregation. The vast majority of occupational families, something like 85%, are racially segregated, even when you control for educational attainment. So that means that Black and Latinx and Indigenous and Pacific Islander workers are largely crowded into a handful of sectors and occupations, which are then defined as being low skill and then structured in really precarious ways, right, where they're left out of basic protections and sort of marginalized from the opportunity to participate and thrive in the economy. And more generally speaking, following the Great Recession, the way that our economy became even more top heavy, there simply haven't been enough good jobs to go around. So we know that prior to the crisis, white workers were about 50% more likely than workers of color to have good jobs, which means they pay a family sustaining wage. There is stability in employment, they're resilient to automation, right? Those kind of job quality characteristics. But even with those racial gaps, for every good job that's available today, there are 50 workers without one. So there are the racial inequities, which are very deep and persistent and built into the system. And then there is also the issue of income inequality and that kind of polarization that's kind of coming together and feeding this storm. So in terms of the findings of our research specifically around COVID coming out of that context, one of the things that we've seen is that Black workers in particular are not recovering from the unemployment spike as quickly as other workers. But we've dug in and found that that's not because the jobs they had prior to the crisis aren't coming back. It's not that those sectors or that kind of work has been eliminated. So we found that if the returning jobs went proportionately to the people that held them prior to the crisis, if the kind of demographics of the workforce remained the same, we would have expected Black unemployment to fall by about 36% since April. Instead, it's only fallen 25%. So that suggests that a lot of Black workers are being kind of pushed further to the margins of the economy, that people are coming back into the labor market underemployed, and kind of being displaced from the skill sets and the occupations that they were able to hold before. The sum total of that means that 20 million people are still out of work, and the kind of persistent racial gaps we saw before are actually broadening and deepening, being exacerbated by COVID. So even if we hadn't seen this pandemic coming and the particular effects of it, the conditions were ripe that any kind of market crash, any kind of disruption could become absolutely catastrophic for communities of color. There was this very precarious base that was being built. And this one is, this crisis is happening at a moment also of profound demographic change, right? So one generation from now, we're no longer going to have a single racial ethnic majority in this country. There's this new plurality that's coming. It's already a reality among young people today that the majority of young children are people of color. It's also happening at a moment of profound political upheaval. And really accelerating processes of technological change and automation that are kind of all coming to bear on this moment and this response. And so all of that is just to say that what we do in these months ahead, how we structure the recovery is going to have really long-lasting effects. It's going to have generational effects, and keeping racial equity at the center of that is really the key to ensuring that we are able to come out of this in a way that all people are able to prosper and thrive. That's got to be the number one item on the table. So I'll turn it back over, Emmanuel.
I really appreciate Abby and Guillermo providing that context, and particularly I think Abby just raising I think what we all know to be true and what we've seen over the summer, that a lot of what we're seeing this year in the crisis and in the lack of recovery is rooted in deep, structural issues. And so I want to actually, I want to pin on that, because I want to ask the group a question a little bit later about how do we kind of, get to a better place, once this is behind us. But to kind of continue this focus on the impact of communities of color, I wanted to ask Anna, NowCab obviously is an organization that is focused on advancing economic mobility for the Latino community through its membership and its focus on a wide range of issues. And so I wanted to, follow up on what Abby and Guillermo had mentioned about the impacts kind of broadly, to ask you, to kind of narrow our focus a little bit more and just give us kind of your perspective and NowCab's perspective on how this crisis has impacted your membership, the Latino community that your membership serves, and really, the community writ large, and particularly, because you all spend a lot of time in this space, how those impacts have played out for the small businesses anchored in these communities and headed by, Latinos and minorities more broadly.
Absolutely. And Tupa, if you could actually share the slides, that would be great. Thank you so much. Well, what Abby and Guillermo said was absolutely a great lead-in into kind of understanding the impact of the pandemic on the Latino community and the small businesses that definitely anchor our community. So as Abby and Guillermo said, prior to the pandemic, there were already dramatic disparities in communities of color, particularly in Latino communities, among health outcomes and economic conditions. And this is especially problematic, not just because disparities, but also Latinos are driving demographic growth in the United States, with high rates of workforce participation and entrepreneurship and a relatively youthful population. As was previously said, Latinos are absolutely key to our economic strength as a country. However, the pandemic and the federal response has exacerbated these inequities. So you should be able to see on this slide here, you can see from the two graphs on the slide, and then from what we've heard already, that the Latino community has been very hard hit by the pandemic. Data shows that Latinos have been infected with the coronavirus at the highest rate of any racial or ethnic group and are dying at similarly high rates as well. And a significant reason for this is Latinos are disproportionately employed in the roles that are considered essential in keeping our food, healthcare, and transportation systems functioning. And as Abby said, like, these are roles that really require you to be in close proximity with other people, and these are roles that can't be done from home. And in addition to these health disparities, nearly 1 in 5 Latino and immigrant workers lost their jobs during the pandemic or had lost their job. And this has been particularly impactful for Latinas, who are disproportionately employed in the leisure and hospitality sector, which has experienced across the board the largest job losses of any sector in the economy. And this is all just kind of added to by the fact that millions of Latino workers, particularly immigrants and including mixed immigration status families, didn't receive unemployment insurance. Pivoting kind of towards the impact on small businesses specifically, there's growing evidence about the impact. And between February and April, for example, Latino business ownership declined 32%. That's compared with 17% for white business owners. And although some business activity was able to resume in May as stay-at-home orders eased in many states, many Latino and immigrant-owned businesses have remained closed. And as the pandemic goes on, it's growing obvious that there's going to be many of these businesses that intended to close just temporarily will actually end up being closed permanently. And this is in no small part due to the minimal action to support vulnerable businesses across the board by the federal government. The Paycheck Protection Program, in particular, did really not that much for the majority of Latino entrepreneurs, particularly those who are sole proprietors and micro business owners. And then broadly, of course, there were the systemic barriers to access, including having banks be the distributor of funds, dealing and navigating with the paperwork, and then also navigating issues with language barriers and just understanding the application overall. So NALCAB in May and June conducted a survey of our network over approximately 80 organizations, trying to better understand what they were facing and what their clients were facing. And over the summer and early fall, we also did further interviews, and that resulted in the report that you see here on the slide, the impact of the coronavirus on the economic well-being of Latino communities in the U.S. And so this report kind of covers that in more depth, in addition to the topics of housing insecurity and then additional unmet basic needs. If we can move on to the next slide. Thank you. I did, however, want to share a little bit about what NALCAB as an organization and as a network has been doing in response to the economic crisis. So for those who may not be familiar, NALCAB, National Association for Latino Community Asset Builders, is a national membership network that supports over 120 nonprofit organizations that serve predominantly Latino and immigrant communities in 40 states, DC, and Puerto Rico. And our mission is to strengthen the economy by advancing economic mobility in Latino communities. And part of the way that we do that is by providing our members with access to capital and resources. So in May and June of this year, we were able to provide about $2 million in emergency relief grants to over 100 member organizations, as well as about $6.5 million in liquidity to NALCAB members that were eligible PPP lenders. And additionally, we also created a sort of hub and spoke system within our network where we referred local small businesses and nonprofit partners to PPP lenders and CDFIs in our network. And so part of that, kind of creating that system within our network, we were able to provide vulnerable businesses and businesses that may not have had access to this federal resource otherwise, just for lack of connection or understanding how to work through the process. We were able to make that possible for a couple hundred businesses as a result. NALCAB has also been quite active with advocacy and public communications, particularly around the CARES Act and its impact on small businesses and nonprofits that are owned or controlled by people of color. We've also been continuing our work trying to push for policy that supports an equitable American economy. And we've actually done this, and we earlier this year published a framework that's outlined in a document called the Latino Economic Agenda that really has become all the more critical as we see the ongoing results of the pandemic on communities of color and the Latino community as a whole. And then just building off of the services that NALCAB typically provides, we've been focused on providing capacity building support, technical assistance, and peer connections to organizations within our network in an effort to help them adapt to providing services to clients remotely. So just kind of before I sign off, I do just kind of want to point out this quote here. It's from our the report on the impact of the coronavirus on Latino communities. And it really does kind of get at the point that having this focus on investing in Latino workers and entrepreneurs and just broadly vulnerable communities is going to be essential as we look towards the future months and protecting some of our nation's communities. With that, I'll pass it back to you, Emmanuel.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Anna. So Joyce, I wanted to, to kind of follow up on Anna's overview of the impact of the crisis in the Latino community. And obviously, a lot of the conversation that we've been having today here, and I think, a lot of what we've all probably seen written or talked about, as it relates to the impact of this crisis has focused on the impact that it has had on Black and Latino communities. And for good reasons. But we also know that the effects of this crisis, as Guillermo had mentioned, as Abby had mentioned, didn't stop at the doorstep of these communities. And so while there are some general misconceptions about the API community, the Asian American Pacific Islanders community, and their kind of general economic well-being, we also know that these communities have taken a rather hard hit in a number of different ways. And so, given the focus that you all have in serving this community and working with your groups to ultimately serve API, the overall API community, can you talk a little bit about some of those impacts and maybe, some of the ones that may not necessarily jump out to folks who have been keeping an eye on what's been going on in the last year?
Sure, thanks. And thanks again for inviting me, Emmanuel, to be a part of this. And I just really want to acknowledge the great work that NALCAB has been doing. We've been looking to their organization to as a really great example of how our organization can also be responding in this moment. So maybe I'll just first start off by talking a little bit about national capacity for folks who aren't familiar with us. We're a 20-year-old national advocacy organization and intermediary, and our coalition is made up of about 100 members that advocate for and organize in low-income Asian American and Pacific Islander communities and neighborhoods. And together with our members, we seek to further a more equitable vision of economic justice. And I'll say in recent years, we've really honed our focus to advocate more on policies that prevent displacement that we're seeing happening across the country in neighborhoods where low-income AAPIs and other communities of color live. And I wanted to start with that because I think contextualizing the impact in terms of place is really important for how we talk about what has been happening in AAPI communities in terms of this pandemic. So something that most folks probably don't know is that over 73% of low-income AAPIs live in America's highest cost cities, and that 50% of AAPIs living in poverty live in just 10 MSAs in the whole country. So what that means is that there's this dramatic concentration of AAPIs that are low income living in certain areas. These MSAs, like New York, Los Angeles, Seattle, are some of those that have been most impacted by the first wave of the COVID-19 pandemic earlier this spring. And this is in regards to the number of confirmed COVID-19 cases. But many of those same cities are the same cities that are now experiencing resurgences in terms of the most recent uptick of confirmed cases as well. And so it's not just the one time, but it's sort of the multiple times that these communities are experiencing the impacts of the pandemic. So with so many APIs concentrated in certain MSAs, it also means that AAPI businesses and AAPI workers are similarly clustered or concentrated in those same areas. And so what we're seeing is that AAPI mom and pop businesses have been struggling, not just since, February or March when a lot of places went into shelter in place or lockdown mode, but in fact, since mid-January. In mid-January, we started receiving reports from across the country of, small businesses being attacked because it was, of xenophobic remarks, that this was a virus that came from China. Folks were seeing dramatic drops in their revenue, between 50 to 80% in sort of our strongest Chinatowns and API ethnic business enclaves across the country. And like Anna alluded to, many of these entrepreneurs have been struggling to figure out, how to apply for the PPP, how to apply for these loan programs when actually it wasn't until a month after the PPP had been released that any information was actually available in languages other than English. And so, these communities were left out of the recovery efforts or the relief efforts from very early on. Additionally, many of these entrepreneurs have been figuring out how to adapt their business models when they've just, historically relied on things like high foot traffic or cash-only transactions because that's the way they've been able to operate for decades. And so making that transition has really revealed the immense tech barrier or tech divide that has really existed in our communities and that so many people weren't prepared to overcome. And so all of this has also meant that many of our small business owners have unfortunately been taken advantage of by predatory scams because they didn't speak English, including from folks in their own community, folks who are offering to help them in times of crisis and in fact taking advantage of them when they are in fact needing resources more than ever. I think, I ran across some recent research that came out of UC Santa Cruz that found that AAPI entrepreneurs actually haven't been able to reopen at the same rate as other entrepreneurs. So this research found that between February and September of this year, the number of active Asian business owners is down 17%. And so by a point of comparison, the same research found that nationally, across all business owners, that the number of active business owners was actually only down 2%. And that for African American and Latinx communities, the number of active business owners is actually up 2% and 1% respectively. So, I think, what this is telling us is that AAPI business owners have really struggled to be able to recover because they've had a longer period of time in which to really be able to address the closures or the revenue impacts that they were having because of the pandemic, but that they also are, concentrated in very specific industries like food and retail, and because of that concentration have really struggled to be able to reopen. I also wanted to highlight that it's not, of course, the business owners only who are suffering, but also their employees. So the impacts of these business closures have also meant some tremendous spikes in unemployment for AAPIs. So for example, in April, New York State reported a 6,900% increase in unemployment filings by Asian Americans. Other states like Minnesota have had some similarly dramatic increases in unemployment filings as well, where there are really large concentrations of AAPI businesses. So as we know, these high rates of unemployment have detrimental and long-term impacts on family financial stability and community health and community well-being. So, the workers, what we're hearing from our members is that workers are scrambling to figure out how to navigate, this whole system, antiquated unemployment systems, how to pay their rent, and doing this all without, adequate language and culturally competent support. So, I think one thing that I just wanted to make sure that I pinpointed was that for the AAPI community, the impacts of this pandemic are not being felt evenly across the community. So, I think it's already been said, Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander communities are experiencing higher rates of COVID, and, they were already struggling with a more difficult economic reality in many low-income NHPI communities. Additionally, Asian Americans in particular were also dealing with the pandemic in a different way, which is, of course, dealing with the racism that came along with COVID-19. So I'm not sure how much folks have heard, but the anti-Asian rhetoric has actually been at an all-time high. In the first quarter of this year, there were over 1,000 hate crimes reported against Asians. And so, I think what this really highlighted is just, this isn't just an economic crisis, but it's also a crisis of, of our conscience and being able to really address, the racism that exists within our communities. So, I do want to say that this it's been 9 months or so since we've been in this pandemic, or longer, and the xenophobia has just persisted throughout. We're still hearing reports of this, and I think certainly it's been fueled by the current administration. So I think, maybe to just kind of close, I do want to say that one thing that I just really want to lift up, because I don't want to be all gloom and doom, is that National Capacity has this incredible network of nonprofit service providers who've been doing incredible work to, quite frankly, like fill this overwhelming need that's in our communities. And so in the spirit of giving thanks, I just really want to acknowledge that it's these community-based organizations that are rising to the challenge to provide language and culturally competent services to these communities. And for AAPI communities, a lot of times these organizations are the only one in their area who can actually provide that service. And so, I just really want to lift up, the incredible work that's happening on the ground, but also just invite folks, if you're interested in learning more about the members of our network and the incredible work they're doing, whether that's, disseminating emergency rental relief, food distribution, you can go to our social media platforms and check us out and just read about some of these incredible stories. So, I'll leave it at that. I know we have more opportunity to discuss later, but just, thank you for having me today. And I think back to you, Emmanuel.
I should take myself off of mute. Thank you. I was just saying that I keep jumping in and out just to make these boxes a little bit more uniform, but appreciate that context and that level setting, Joyce and Anna, just, going beyond the data. I want to kind of, obviously acknowledge that a lot of, again, what we've been talking about here is focusing on the impact of people and communities, and similar to my comment earlier, for good reasons, but it came up in your comments, Joyce, it came up in your comments, Anna, that many small businesses are facing, a severe crisis, some, an existential crisis that could fundamentally, reshape the small business landscape, and how well this works as a, at least in the next few months or years, the active building potential of this vehicle for many low and moderate communities of color. And so I wanted to, Tina, as someone that is obviously focused on this work at Citi, and really, working at an institution like Citi that has been supporting impacted communities and supporting small businesses during this crisis, even before this crisis, I wanted to just, have you come in and talk a little bit about the work that you all have been doing to support communities as we get through this crisis in this moment right now, and kind of how does that connect back to the larger small business work that you all had been doing prior to this crisis?
Absolutely, and thanks, Emmanuel. I really appreciate the chance to be with you all today, and it's been great just to collaborate with you, Emmanuel, as well as David Newville, others at Prosperity Now, and colleagues from across ABPN, including all the fellow panelists who laid such a great foundation for today's conversation already on recovery strategies and mobilization plans. I think it's particularly critical that we come together as a coalition now to address the disproportionate impact that communities of color have experienced. And I'll start, just more broadly, perhaps, and then move to the small business piece, but just by sharing high points of Citi's recent efforts as an institution to address and help close the racial wealth gap, and then again, move to the context within small business that's already been discussed, and I'll just elaborate on what the great comments that have already been said. So the COVID-19 pandemic, as everyone already eloquently stated, I think already exacerbated the existing income and asset gaps by race. And we know that persistent and pervasive systemic and structural racism really underpins so much of the devastation that we've all seen occur this year, and again, even well prior to the crisis. This fall, Citi launched Action for Racial Equity, which represents an unprecedented effort to leverage Citi's core business capabilities to intentionally move the needle in addressing racial equity in the U.S. The Action for Racial Equity's $1 billion in business investments will include expanded access to banking and credit among communities of color. It will ensure that more Black entrepreneurs get the financing they need to start and grow their businesses, and tackle the homeownership crisis in communities of color as well by increasing access to mortgages and supporting developers of color. And lastly, it will look at strengthening Citi's practices and policies in this regard. I also suggest if you have a chance to take a look at Citi Global Economist GPS report, which was called Closing the Racial Inequality Gaps, which found that if the US had actually closed key racial gaps for Black Americans in wages, housing, education, and investment 20 years ago, we could have added $16 trillion to the US economy. And if we did act and close these gaps today, $5 trillion could be added over the next 5 years to GDP. While the Action for Racial Equity is a recent commitment, we've, as Emmanuel alluded to, we've prioritized a racial lens in our community partnerships for many years, starting with our support to build and preserve ownership among communities of color, which, as you all know, one great example is ABPN, of which Citi has been the sole corporate member for more than a decade. And we've been really proud to work collectively across ABPN partners, both to help prioritize infrastructure for the network's activities, as well as to partner with individual members in your incredible work to support your institution strategies to address these critical issues on an institution-specific level. So coming back around on the small business side, as Anna and Joyce and Abby all mentioned, so many small businesses have been decimated in the wake of COVID-19. We've seen extremely concerning projections. A MetLife and US Chamber survey showed that most small businesses are concerned about financial hardship right now, unsurprisingly. 58% worry about having to close permanently. And we know that the numbers since March have been staggering. When you break down the race of owners, we can see from the National Bureau of Economic Research data that 41% of Black-owned firms, 32% of Latinx owners disappeared between February and April alone. And that's on top of everything that Joyce shared, which is just, again, appalling and staggering. So when you look at the sector as a whole, I think even more recent information shows that between 60 and 70% of businesses could be closed. And the sectoral analysis and breakout that you shared, Joyce, I think is also critical to take a look at and think about with all of this. So well before the pandemic, we focused at Citi on preserving legacy businesses with our ABPM partners and others, really trying to anchor local wealth and jobs, as well as provide access to critical goods and services, and again, intentionally prioritizing race in those efforts. We've engaged in our national multi-year effort aimed at preserving Black-owned or operated small businesses, as well as other businesses owned by people of color. And starting in 2013, invested in capital access, research, and capacity building toward these ends. One example is Citi worked with the National Urban League, another great ABPM partner, and the Democracy at Work Institute to look at the potential for legacy businesses to convert their firms to employee-owned entities, and launched about 12 convenings around the country that brought together municipalities, capital providers, and others to explore targeted tools and strategies that expand this investment in Black-owned or operated businesses. And since the advent of the pandemic in the US, we've also added more resources to these efforts to help support crisis management for businesses in transition around the country during these really difficult times. With partners like Project Equity, we've provided for support for individual companies to keep their businesses open and consider approaches so that, again, employees can buy these businesses potentially. And I think many of our research and nonprofit teams have, since the crisis, thought about what might be sort of the new going forward environment that could inform some of this work. NALCAB and National Capacity, for example, have led small business anti-displacement studies over the years, which are so pertinent now as I think they were at the time that they were launched again a few years ago. Another project was our collaborative effort with Smart Growth America to think about and take a look at opportunity zones, which we all, a year plus ago, this was such an important thought about how it could reshape the fabric of the small business market and impact communities. And I think what's interesting with the Smart Growth America group, DOWI, the Democracy at Work Institute, which I mentioned, produced a paper that really qualitatively assessed the experiences of longstanding legacy businesses owned by people of color in various communities, and also looked at macro quantitative data in addition to the qualitative study to produce recommendations that could include enhanced reporting, transparency mechanisms, and a deeper focus on community-led and centered investments. I guess the last study that I'll mention for now, there are so many that all the partners have contributed to, but one nonprofit group that we've worked with in the past, Rutgers University, examined the impact of COVID specifically on employee-owned versus non-employee-owned businesses. and thought about, what is the sustainability and employment impact that's been had in these very difficult times. And I think, majority employee ownership stock plan or ESOP firms maintain their standard hours, maintain salaries at significantly higher rates than other firms. And we're also more likely to provide protective or health measures for their employees, which is something critically important in this climate and just in general when thinking about the thesis of businesses being sustainable and resilient in general. So specific to Citi's response, we've worked on supporting CDFIs in the face of the crises we've seen. And I'll note that Citi's allocating an additional $50 million to its impact fund exclusively to support businesses owned by Black entrepreneurs, which will bring the total capital in that account to $200 million. The PPP came up, and Citi in April announced plans to donate net profits from participation in PPP, and 25 of those million have been donated to the Citi Foundation. Just last week, 15 million of that in unrestricted funding was announced to support, again, CDFIs specifically working among the small business community, small businesses owned by people of color, as well as low and moderate income communities. The additional 10 million of which went to CDFIs in a specific loan fund, working across small businesses and thinking about, what is the appropriate working capital, payroll, operating, and emergency maintenance response that we can come up with. And then I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that in the broader context of Citi and the Citi Foundation, we've reached over 100 million in commitments for COVID-19 community and economic recovery efforts since June. And we have a partnership program with the National Banking Association where Citi's created a purchasing facility that allows it to buy loans in the secondary market from minority-owned depository institutions, which originated under the PPP. So our purchasing facility in that regard will assume up to 50 million in SBA loans from MDIs. I've said a lot, and I want to again acknowledge and thank all the panelists that have shared and others to come, because you're all, just great examples of leading the programmatic and policy responses to this work. And just as a sort of logistical note, the organizers have the research resources that I mentioned if you'd like to review them more closely, and look forward to continuing the dialogue today and going forward. So thank you again, Emmanuel, and everyone at Prosperity Now.
Sure, thank you. Thank you, Tina, for that. I do, just being mindful of time here, I do want to kind of move us to policy and kind of looking ahead, in the short term and a little bit over the long term. But, over the last 8 months, Congress, in response, obviously, to the crisis that we all face and to the spike in unemployment and to the closure of businesses or the threat of closure of businesses, Congress has spent an enormous amount of money, propping up the economy and making sure that things don't go any further south. Anna mentioned the PPP program. We also had the EIPs, economic impact payments, the boost to unemployment, including the extra $600 a week and the extra 13 weeks of unemployment, have all been part of that massive spending. And so I think first, before we pull you in, you are our resident policy expert here. I wanted to just quickly, obviously we can't dig into all the details about those policies and how well they've worked or haven't worked, and plenty of other folks and institutions, including many folks on this panel, have written and talked about that. But Guillermo, you had mentioned this earlier, and we wanted to hold it for a moment, but I wanted to just ask you briefly if you could, obviously it's a one small example, but it's something that has been debated in Congress and added to the HEROES Act and then removed from what happens in the Senate. And, there's conversations about the importance of it and not in terms of future stimulus packages. But to talk a little bit about the research that Prosperity Now, that your team did around the EIPs, and some of the findings there about how important having that $1,200, that $2,400, what have you, was to families over the last 6 or 7 months.
Sure, happy to provide that context. So basically, the short answer to your question is yes, very effective for those who received it. It has been a lifeline for millions of households. In June and July of this year, we conducted a survey of about 2,000 lower income households, defined as those making less than $50,000 a year. to understand how COVID-19 had affected their financial lives, and especially how these economic impact payments had, what kind of support they provided to these households. And so first, with this sort of a diagnosis of how they were navigating the crisis, how they were experiencing, what we knew is that roughly 40% of these lower income households were feeling worse off financially as a result of the pandemic. And more specifically, about half of the households we interviewed were unable to cover one basic expense, such as housing, food, or medical care. I meant to say that this was a national sample. We used like quotas and tried to have a sample that mimics the distribution of the population nationwide by race, ethnicity, and income brackets within this lower income group. What we found is that about 84% of the lower income households we surveyed had indeed received the economic impact payment under the CARES Act. We also saw some discrepancies there when it came to race or ethnicity, with Black or Latino respondents being less likely, to be specific, 8 percentage points less likely to receive the check than their white counterparts. We also observed that those in the lowest income brackets were less likely to receive the stimulus check than those in the higher income brackets, even within our population that were all low income people. And so there are clearly some barriers to some of these households didn't receive the checks because they were not eligible. Earlier, I mentioned the fact that broad segments of the immigrant population did not, were not eligible under the terms of this law to be able to get these relief payments. And then when we asked specifically about how these households were able to use these resources and how they spend this money, and to be more specific about that, what we see is that a lot of the households, a big proportion of the households had used this to cover really basic, regular, financial commitments or needs, such as buying groceries, paying for utilities, regular debt payments, and so forth. It's very much a minority of the group that was able to either save or use the funds to cover non-essential, well, so-called non-essential items. The other interesting thing that we came across is that those households, Black or Latino households, were more likely to rely on alternative financial products to be able to cover their financial commitments, even in addition to having the economic impact payments. So that poses some additional challenges because some of those alternative financial products come with high fees or rates, or some of them are payday loans that we know that have some challenges and put people in a debt trap, or have the likelihood of put people in a further in an even more vulnerable situation. So so I do feel that that this has served a good purpose. Unfortunately, there is still uncertainty about the future of these supports, but if people are interested in seeing in further detail some of this information, we have a report that is going to be shared through the chat box. It's called Navigating COVID-19 Crisis or something like that. But happy to answer any more questions, but I'm very aware that we're running out of time, so I want to turn it back to you, Emmanuel or Rob, to share your piece.
Yeah, no, thank you, Guillermo. And Rob, just picking up on the EIP stuff, that the research that Guillermo had mentioned, 1 month and a day or 2 days from now, the day after Christmas, something like 12 million people are going to lose unemployment benefits. Obviously, the EIPs, for many folks, are long gone. There was a small window to claim them that is, I think, now closed. At the end of this year, many parts of the CARES Act will expire. And so, we're going into what is already shaping out to be a problematic and rough winter, health-wise, economic-wise. And the supports that we have are limited, or that impacted families have are limited or non-existent. And then in addition to that, there's a stalemate in Congress on what to do.
Mm-hmm.
The leadership conference, you in particular, are obviously in conversations often with folks on the Hill about these kind of issues. And so I just wanted to, if you could just give us a sense of what's happening on the Hill. What are you all focusing on? Obviously, there have been a lot of exclusions in some of these provisions that are missing out immigrant communities and that kind of thing. So just, fill us in on the policy and the work that you all are doing, over the next
Sure.
few
Yeah,
weeks.
and if I can just add to the things that are expiring, is the CDC has a moratorium on evictions that is set to expire. Now that could potentially be renewed administratively, but there are a slew of issues arising from that around what do small landlords do, just take a few more months of losses and hope for the best. Or, that's another thing that Congress is going to need to ultimately address. So in terms, so I can just talk a little bit about the leadership conference first. We are an umbrella organization for over 200 national groups, representing African American community, Latino, APIA, labor union. All the major labor unions are members of our group, of our umbrella. And so what we do is try to corral all that that needs to be done around these issues. And I want to just raise a few of our key priorities moving forward. One of obviously the first and foremost is just dealing with the immediate healthcare crisis, but from our coalition's perspective, doing it in an equitable way, making sure that that vaccine, hopefully, we're getting more optimistic about vaccines coming, but we need to make sure that all communities are getting them, and that there's issues around hesitancy in some communities around participating in that. And we also need to make sure that we're making all the services accessible to LEP and immigrant communities, among others. Moving beyond that is just, there's the broader economic catastrophe that is happening, and we're lifting up the need for protecting working people, expanding unemployment and sick leave and other policies, and making sure that that workplace safety standards are doing some good in preventing more people from falling victim to this. Stimulus payments has been on the table as well. A second round of that, increasing access to SNAP relief, EITC and child tax credit, and making sure that people don't lose utilities over an inability to pay. I mentioned the need for additional housing assistance, so we need rental assistance to actually fully deal with the problem, not just moratoriums, but then PPP loans is another area, and education is another one where especially as more and more students are being sent back home full time for schools, it's a continuing issue that needs to be addressed. And then in addition, Joyce, for example, mentioned the hate and bias, and that is something that we are pushing to have. There is legislation that would at least provide some help to getting a better handle on it, that we're hoping could be part of this. Part of some COVID relief. That said, and here's where it gets gloomy, is that there is a lot of uncertainty about what Congress is actually going to do. The House passed a bill that addresses all of those issues and then some in May, and passed another bill in I think it was September, to try to just put some pressure on the Senate and to take some action in return, and the Senate just has not budged. And in the coming weeks, I'm not real optimistic about what the Senate is going to do. There's a few issues in play. One is that the Senate majority has been really bent on trying to include some kind of reform, some kind of tort reform, liability reform that would make it harder for employers for employees who fall sick to allege that there were violations of workplace safety standards. And I mean, that is something that just makes it a non-starter among in the Democratic-controlled House and with our groups as well. There's the attitude that among a lot of people in the Senate that there's going to be more of a focus on austerity, especially as there's a transition over to the new administration. That the same kind of Tea Party, cut spending and don't have any deficits is going to take increasing hold again. And there's already the attitude among a lot of the Senate that that we already did this one round in the CARES Act, and why are we spending why are we talking about spending another several $1 trillion? So continued uncertainty around there. And the sad part is that there is bipartisan support for a number of these things. PPP loans in particular just policies to expand PPP lending and to renew it has bipartisan support. Another one that's you might be surprised to hear is that stimulus payments, to the extent we can get new stimulus payments, there is a good amount of bipartisan support for making sure that mixed status families are not excluded. The CARES Act said that if you file jointly and one of you uses an ITIN number, then that family cannot get a stimulus payment. And a lot of and there's a bipartisan recognition that that's just penalizing people for who they love. And so if there's so those are getting caught up in a broader struggle over just really comprehensive COVID relief, and there's a lot of moving parts in there. And so we're going to be focused a lot we're about to send another letter just after Thanksgiving to Congress, summing up all of our priorities and trying to continue the pressure on the Senate. But I think it's more likely we'll see something take shape in 2020. And obviously what happens in the Georgia elections is going to shape who's in control of the Senate and who's going to have more control of the agenda there. So a lot to be continued.
Thank you, Rob. And just obviously there's a lot going on. There's a lot to be done moving forward. I'm mindful of the time, and so we'll follow up with any questions with the speakers directly. I will say that there is something that Abby had mentioned in the thread that I think goes throughout this, is that there are obviously very significant structural issues that predated this crisis, and if we're to borrow a phrase from the incoming administration, build back better, there has to be intentional work done to kind of lay a better foundation for an inclusive economy. And so we did not get to that today, but we're hoping that we can explore that in a little bit more detail in a future conversation. That said, I do want to thank our speakers today and everyone that has attended the webinar. And so thank you to Anna, Guillermo, Joyce, Rob, Abby, who had to leave for a brief moment, Tina, and then also my colleague Tupa, who's been helping us with the technology here on the webinar. Appreciate the time. Thank you all for joining us. Hope you have a happy Thanksgiving, and we'll continue this conversation in the near future. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.